Hello, my name is Christina Davis. I'm the director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations at Harvard University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today for a panel on Japan, the U.S., and economic security policy linkages in the Taiwan Strait. Actually, we're here in Boston, it's the morning, but we are joined by many from East Asia for whom it is Monday evening, so good evening. We're going to be talking at a time where there are many flashpoint issues with rising tensions in world affairs. As Russian troops are amassed on the border with Ukraine, Chinese fighter jets make daily incursions into the Taiwanese air defense identification zone. Some strategists fear the possibility of imminent military conflict. In the shadow of these security tensions, we see economic interdependence turning from a source of cooperation to another dimension of conflict, with fears of both economic competition harming industries and economic coercion harming national security. Nowhere is this more pronounced than when it comes to Taiwan. The president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, wrote in the recent issue of Foreign Affairs that Taiwan's high-tech leadership and globalized workforce put it in the position to secure global supply chains, even referring to Taiwan's dominance in the world semiconductor industry as a silicon shield that allows Taiwan to protect itself. From the perspective of the United States and Japan, there are fears their economy may be held up if there is any disruption. They both induced the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to build factories in the United States and Japan, even as both Japan and the United States governments are ramping up industrial policy, supporting domestic capacity, and increasing their screening of commercial exchange in a wide range of trade and investment, with potential dual use. Japan's government recently added a new cabinet position for economic security, with Minister Takayuki Kobayashi declaring that supply chain security is a national priority, which of course mirrors repeated emphasis coming from the Biden administration that it is laser focused on supply chain problems. How can we balance the need for global markets with free flow of goods and ideas amidst fears that we cannot trust trade with some actors, especially the fears that reliance on China has grown too deep? Here today, we have a panel of experts who bring academic and government experience to help us think through these questions. I would like to introduce our panel of speakers before I turn it over to them to give us their remarks. Our first speaker is Professor Shelley Rigger, Brown Professor of East Asian Politics at Davidson College. She's the preeminent scholar of Taiwan's domestic politics, cross-strait economic relations, and Taiwanese perceptions of mainland China. Her recent book, The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise, just released this year, builds on work she has also written, Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island, Global Powerhouse, and many other publications. She will be joined with Professor Tain-Jy Chen, who is speaking to us from Taipei. He is a senior professor of economics at the Taipei School of Economics and Political Science and professor emeritus at National Taiwan University. An economist by training, he is the former president of Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research, the former Minister for Council for Economic Planning and Development, and National Defense Council. He is a widely published expert on Taiwanese firms, supply chains, and East Asia's trade and investment. We will also be hearing from Japan. Joining us is Lieutenant General, retired, Sadamasa Oe, who is a senior fellow at the Asia Pacific Initiative and a retired lieutenant general in the Japan Air Self-Defense Forces. He was a senior fellow at Harvard University Asia Center 2019 to 2021, when he led us through a difficult time as everything moved remote and was a leader among our fellows here at Harvard in that unusual time. He is also an associate with the program on U.S.-Japan relations earlier, and in his distinguished career has served as a commander of the Northern Air Defense and the commander of the Air Material Command. He's an expert on ballistic missile defense, artificial intelligence, F-35, and other Japan alliance issues. Finally, we are very happy to have joining us Ambassador Daniel Russel, who is the Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. In his distinguished diplomatic career, he has served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council and Director of the Office of Japan Affairs. We are so delighted to have expertise ranging from Japan, Taiwan, and the United States to discuss these critical issues today. And we are also being joined by a large audience of over 100 ranging around the United States and East Asia, as well as many of our associates here in the room for a hybrid seminar. I would like to thank our staff, Shinju Fujihira, Amy Stockton, Emma Duncan, for all of their work to prepare for this event. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. This event is part of our special series on policy innovations in crises. Let me briefly review our Zoom etiquette before we proceed to the event. I would ask you to please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking. And after each of our speakers has remarks for about 12 minutes, we'll open up for questions from the audience, which you may ask in the chat or raise hand button. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn over now to Professor Ricker.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and a real pleasure to actually be here as opposed to talking to my computer in my office back in North Carolina. So this is really a treat. And I thank you for your fortitude in having an in-person event. So here we are. So I think I'll just kick things off. The expertise in the room regarding Japan and Taiwan's economy, some of the other topics is there's a lot more firepower elsewhere on the panel than me. So I thought what I would do is just kind of set the scene a little bit by talking about the security situation in the Taiwan Strait, and in particular, the contributions that recent, are they policy changes? Are they just statements? Are they misstatements? Whatever they are from Washington have been complicating this security situation in the Taiwan Strait. So I think that a really useful way for understanding what's going on in the Taiwan Strait is the international relations framework of the security dilemma. The situation that ensues when two states are seeking to deter one another from taking action that they believe is highly disadvantageous to their own interests. But what happens in a security dilemma is, one side takes an action which it intends as defensive or deterrent, but it is perceived as offensive or aggressive by the other side. And so the other side responds with its own action, which it understands to be a defensive action, but that's perceived as aggressive on the other side. So you get this escalating spiral of activity, which each side intends as defensive, but the other side perceives as aggressive and offensive. Security dilemmas, at least as they are analyzed in the international relations literature, are manageable and can be kind of unwound or de-escalated because neither side is actually seeking to change the status quo. Neither side is actually aiming at the core interests of its partner, if you will, in the security dilemma. So if the two sides can understand that that's what's going on, they can manage their relationship and avoid conflict. And one of the ways that the literature suggests that states do this is by combining deterrence with statements and actions that are reassuring to the other side. So we don't want to see you doing this, but we also want you to know that we have no intention of doing this other thing that you're afraid of. So what troubles me about recent US policy or the sort of conversation about Taiwan in the United States right now is that it seems to me that there are understandable reasons why Beijing might perceive the US actually to be going after core interests of the PRC, as opposed to simply taking actions aimed at deterring Beijing's potential aggression against Taiwan. So the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, as I understand it, is that Taiwan is neither fully nor independent nor part of the People's Republic of China. It is effectively independent in all of the normal functions of statehood. Taiwan operates as a state, but it has never detached itself finally from the idea of China. So it has never been part of the PRC, and in fact, no political party of any import in Taiwan has ever expressed a willingness to become part of the PRC. But nor has any political party of consequence in Taiwan said Taiwan rejects the idea of a Chinese identity completely and declares itself to be an entirely separate political entity. So that, if that is the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, then the status quo in US policy has always been the status of Taiwan is sort of undecided, incomplete. The US recognizes that the PRC and at one time also the leadership in Taiwan believed in this idea, and the PRC still believes in this idea that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of it. But the US is not taking a position on that ultimately. Rather, the US has acknowledged that this is the preference of the, that this is the preference of the PRC, that this was the preference of the Taiwanese leadership in the 1970s when all of this verbiage was worked out. And so what the position that the US takes is that efforts by either side to change Taiwan's status in a non-peaceful or unilateral way is unacceptable to the US. So we leave open the possibility of any outcome in the Taiwan Strait. And here's where I see US policy potentially changing in some ways in recent years, more intensively in recent months, and even more intensively just in the last few days, right? The US appears to be shifting its policy, or at least the logic of its policy, if not the actual declaratory policy itself, shifting toward the idea that Taiwan should be separate from mainland China, that it is in the strategic interest of the US to maintain the separation of Taiwan from the mainland. And that is a very significant challenge to the PRC's fundamental understanding of its own interests. And it deviates from the status quo in a really significant way. The US has always used democracy, Taiwan's democracy, as the rationale for wanting Taiwan to be able to decide its own future, or the Taiwanese people to decide their own future. But if it is in fact in the interest of the United States for Taiwan to be permanently separated from the Chinese mainland, from the PRC, from the very idea of China, that it is the US that has taken us out of the security dilemma and put us into an actual confrontation of fundamental principles and interests. So I'm not sure that US officials, and I'm very eager to hear what Danny Russel has to say about this. I'm not sure US officials really mean to be doing this, but it is absolutely where their language is taking us. And I'm talking about statements like a statement by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific, Eli Ratner, in the last few days, where he gave Taiwan's strategic importance to the US as the reason for the US continuing to support Taiwan. We've also, President Biden himself has made a number of statements that seemed to deviate from policy, although in most cases, other officials walked those back and attributed them to misstatements. Then you have members of the US Congress, who we in the US tend to think of as kind of actors with no particular connection to the core US policymaking function, but who the PRC perceives as voices of the American government, right? So members of the US Congress who have made really extreme statements, including Representative Nancy Mace from the state adjacent to mine, although in North Carolina, we sometimes imagine that we are slightly more advanced than South Carolina, but I don't know. But anyway, Representative Nancy Mace said, you know, I have just touched down in the Republic of Taiwan, and I mean it 100% behind this idea of the Republic of Taiwan. So who suffers from a policy change along these lines? Or if it's not a policy change, the perception of a policy change along these lines in Beijing? I will tell you who suffers. Taiwan suffers. Because Taiwan is the shrimp between the whales, right? Taiwan is the small party that does not have freedom of action either from the PRC or from the US. Let us be honest, right? The Taiwanese government cannot say no to the US when the US is trying to be, in its own view, helpful to Taiwan. So Taiwan, having been very careful over the last few years not to challenge the status quo, now finds itself with the status quo being challenged by the actor that claims to be Taiwan's ally. And then just sort of one final point, Taiwan also suffers. The Taiwanese president also suffers from these kinds of statements, because it puts her under political pressure domestically to take a stronger line against the PRC. Because what her domestic critics on the green side, so on the independence leaning side, will say is, you see, the US is ready. The US is 100% behind us. The US wants the Republic of Taiwan to be called into being. And Taiwan knows better than this. But these kinds of statements from the US definitely increase the challenge for her of managing that kind of domestic political pressure. Finally, because this is an event sponsored by a Japan Institute, I also think these changes in US policy, or these potential changes in US policy, could be a real problem for Japan, which is seeking to align itself more closely with US policy on the Taiwan issue. But if US policy is changing, and especially if it's changing without maybe being all the implications clearly thought through, that puts Japan also, the Japanese government, in a tricky state. So I think that's my 12 minutes, and I will hand it off to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And because we have a hybrid seminar, we can hand off all the way to Taipei with Professor Chen joining us next.
So I'm due to speak. Well, thank you for having me. It's really an honor to join this very important seminar with the experts from US and Japan. As a Taiwanese, I'm really very thankful for our friends to be so much supportive of our people and our country. But I'm going to speak about the economic perspective of the cross-strait links. You know, the link which I think is not only important for the world economy, but also I think is good for our own security. Although it may be seen as some potential danger to the function of the world economy if we have problem on the strait. So Taiwan, you know, since China's reform and opening in 1978, we have been debating on whether Taiwan should be engaged in Chinese economic development, or we should stay outside of this process. And I think this debate will never ended But eventually, I think the majority of people believe that engagement is the right policy. And I think I also of the believer that engagement in the economic development process of China, in a sense of helping China to a certain extent, particularly in the early stage of getting into the international market and starting some very basic industries, is good for the cross-strait relationship. And even today, many people are also concerned with the semiconductor industry, which Taiwan seems to play an important role in the advanced chips. And therefore that may pose a risk. I still think that this ability of Taiwan's semiconductor industry to support the Chinese electronic industries or some other international operations in China is of some value to our own security. We have the idea that if Taiwan has nothing to be valued by the Chinese authority, then they will not hesitate just to bung up Taiwan and destroy everything from this land. You know, this is the kind of regime which pay no sympathy to human life and human rights. Just remember what they have done to Hong Kong, and imagine what they will have done it if Taiwan is just like the highland province of China. You know, so I think be able to possess in some important industries, important technologies is of some value to the security of Taiwan itself. Some people are talking about Chinese militaries may eventually invade Taiwan in order to take over our semiconductor industry. And I should say that's not going to be the case. If China is going to invade into Taiwan, it's not for the sake of taking over the semiconductor industry. It's for something else, you know, because the war itself is going to destroy the industry. And after the war, everybody will be gone. All the experts in that industry will be gone. So let me just give you a brief description of the current situation, particularly regarding to the semiconductor industry. China now is our biggest trading partner, both on the export side and the import side, okay? We export about 28% of our export to China, and we import about 22% of our all import from China. So China is the top destination for our trade in both ways. And out of these export and import, the semiconductor product also constitute the most important items. In the area of Taiwan's export to China, the semiconductor product account for about 40% of the total export. Out of the import from China to Taiwan, the semiconductor product account for about 25%. So they are both very important in both ends. However, the majority of these products, the semiconductor product, are not Taiwanese product. They are product of the multinational firms. They may be made in Taiwan. For example, Apple has its phone chips fabricated in Taiwan by TSMC. And after the fabrication, this chip will be shipped to China via Hong Kong in most cases and to be put into the iPhones, okay? Taiwan also have its own electronic industry, so we need memory chips. So we buy memory chips from Samsung, from Hynix, and from Micron, and some of their plants are located in China, so therefore we import their product. So therefore that on both direction of the trade, only a few items there are involved. The Taiwanese companies or the Chinese company. It's the multinational operations. It's the strategy multinational companies division of labor, which determine the flow of trade between the two sides of the strait. And of course, because of the scale economy, as you know, the scale economy of the semiconductor industry, as the technology advances, it become more and more important. So that means a fab has to be so big in order to be efficient. So therefore, you can't afford to have too many semiconductor companies. So therefore, you have these advanced technologies now concentrate on three most advanced company, namely TSMC, Intel, and Samsung. However, I think the fab itself could be diversified to a certain extent, but also not too much, not too diversified either. So out of these fabrication, for example, there are many things are fabricated in Taiwan, for example, by TSMC. However, they may be tested and assembled at the final stage of the semiconductor fabrication process, which may take place in China, or sometime they take place in Malaysia and Vietnam now. So therefore, that I think concentrating these fabrication site in a few countries is something just inevitable because of the advancement of technology. It's just not possible to have many countries producing this kind of product at the same time, as the technology goes. So for many years now, China, of course, has a big ambition for the semiconductor industry. So therefore, they give very strong incentive to encourage multinational firms to invest in China. So the Chinese semiconductor product, in terms of fabrication, that are mostly yet also coming from multinational firms, not the Chinese companies themselves. So Intel, Samsung, Hynix, TSMC, they all have big fab in China. Okay, with 100% ownership, I think everybody understands that protecting the IP is important. Our government, since early 2000, when the policy was switched from initially prohibiting investing in Chinese semiconductor industry from allowing investment in that area, with the condition that the technology that you apply in China must be 2 generations behind the prevailing technology that used in Taiwan. And this policy has not changed since then. So for example, when TSMC was allowed to invest in China a few years ago, they are approved to apply the 28 nano processing technology. That given that the prevailing technology in Taiwan at that time is 14 nano. So that there's always our government has a policy of all investment project above $1 million need to be approved by the government before the investment. And this special sensitive industry such as semiconductor is under special attention. It needs to be reviewed very carefully, and many conditions are attached to all these investment projects. And of course, the company themselves are also careful in protecting their own IP, because this is vital to their survival. So you look at the TSMC's factory in Nanjing of China, they have about 500 engineers sent from Taiwan to do the core operations. And those people are kept separate from local employees. They are living in different places from the local people. The local recruit will never be allowed to, access the sensitive technologies. So I think they knew how to protect their own IP, and of course they have to obey the laws. Either it's the laws of the U.S. or the laws of China, as far as this operation is concerned. I think the current condition, I gave you some figures about how important semiconductor products are in the cross-strait trade. That figure are actually increasing every year. You look back 4 or 5 years ago, the percentage is not a lot high. Okay, but this is all the result of this transformation of the industry, and also the strategy of the multinational firms. So it is the multinational operations which are really dictate how the supply chain will be configured. And I think this, of course, from a pure economic point of view, this supply chain so constructed across the Taiwan Strait has been very stable and resilient. During this the COVID epidemic era, the 2 years now since 2020, since 2021, when we had first case in Wuhan, a lot of disruption has occurred to international shipping, particularly in the area of sea, right? The port are congested and a lot of problems due to the logistics and the inland shipping. So therefore, you have a lot of disruptions on the supply chain, which occur, affect almost every commodity. But if you look at the most important product around this time, which is IT, computers, the cell phones and the laptops, and your iPad and so on, most of these products were produced in China, and they are produced there by Taiwanese companies using the supply chain crossing this Taiwan Strait. And although there's a lot of complaint about the delay of shipping and other things, but don't forget, they continue to supply and they continue to operate in pretty much full capacity. Okay, due to the congestion on the sea line shipping, many of those products now are coming from China through the airlines to Taiwan, and then another airline ship them to the Western countries. That's how in the world is being kept on receiving this quite stable, I think, actually increasing in volume, but because of the dramatic increase from the demand side, you probably have to wait, a longer time. The kind of waiting is not something we are accustomed to. But I think this indicating that this cross-strait supply chain, although that the political atmosphere now between the two governments now is very bad. But however, that the Chinese government has not done sort of something to interrupt in this process. For example, I mentioned the air traffic, right? The air cargo, which are shipping this product from mainland to the rest of the world via Taiwan, which go through the so-called the cross-strait air traffic. Of course, China can shut down those lines if they like. Okay, so the reason they didn't do it, I believe, is for their own interests. That's what I mean. Maybe maintaining this is something good for the stability of the cross-strait security also. Of course, that we all understand, ourselves understand, that when we have 40% of our export, I'm talking about 28% of Taiwan's export going to China, but if we include Hong Kong, the percentage will go up to 40% more. So we are also concerned. We are looking at this item by item every day and to see whether we depend on the other side too much and therefore constitute a supply chain risk when something happens. Okay, but the conclusion is yes, there is always a dependency risk you have to bear in mind. So I think this supply chain has been built when U.S. has a strategy of engagement also, when a cross-strait relationship is not as today's tensions like today. So I understand that because of this change of the geopolitics, it is probably necessary to restructure this supply chain, and it's been going on already since the trade war began in 2018. The restructuring of the supply chain has slowly taken place. We have not seen too much of this in the IT industry, but we already seen a lot of these in the other more traditional product, such as clothing and others. They are all now shifting to Southeast Asia. But during this pandemic, because some of the Southeast Asian factories are not operating, so therefore that the orders may have gone back to China. So you actually see an increase of Chinese export to the United States. But I think if the COVID is over, this picture will change. Okay, so it's quite obvious to us that the alternative, the diversification, has to go from China to Southeast Asia. Okay, and they are building all kind of infrastructure and also the supply chain there. So we really have to pay attention to this restructuring process, and to making sure that we have this supply, the supply of goods, commodities across the countries between Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asian countries can go free without any barriers. And more importantly, I think we need to invest in more human resources, particularly technological engineers in Southeast Asian countries, in order to kind of rebuild some of the important supply chain, for example, the supply chain for the semiconductor industry in those countries. Okay, that's all I have to say. I will stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so very much. That's an incredible overview of the economic perspective. I'm glad to hear some reassurance that business as usual may continue a little longer. I would like to hear now from Lieutenant General Sadamasa Ue, who is joining us from Tokyo.
Okay, can you hear me, Christina?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay, very good, thank you. I'm really honored to talk on this important topic from Japan's perspective, particularly security aspect. A joint statement issued after a meeting between Prime Minister Suga and President Biden in April this year said, "We underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage a peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues." The statement also said, Japan resolved to bolster its own national defense capabilities to further strengthen the alliance and regional security. This was the first time in 52 years since the Sato-Nixon statement for the reversion of Okinawa prior to the normalization of diplomatic relations between Japan and China, that Taiwan was included in a summit agreement between the leaders of Japan and the US. Now the Taiwan issue has become a matter of great concern in Japan, as manifested by the recent statement of the former Prime Minister Abe. On December 1st, Abe said, "The Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency. In other words, it is also a contingency for the Japan-US alliance. President Xi Jinping should never misunderstand this recognition." In response, the Chinese government expressed its firm opposition, calling it a violent interference in China's internal affairs. So it is important to comprehend this historical issue in a proper context so as to prevent a catastrophic conclusion. The Japanese government position on the Taiwan issue has been consistent since the Japan-China joint statement of September 1972, and the April joint statement is also consistent with that position. According to the commentary of former ambassador to the United States, Kuriyama, who was involved in the Japan-China peace negotiation at the time as director of the treaty division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Japan's position is as follows. Number one, it is Japan's hope that the Taiwan issue will be resolved peacefully through discussions between the parties on both sides of Taiwan Strait. Second, the Japanese government fully understands and respects China's position that Taiwan is an integral part of China's territory, but it has not accepted this position. Third, in the unlikely event that China were to use force to unify Taiwan in the future and an armed conflict were to erupt, Japanese government will reserve its position on Japan's response. Number four, the intention of the Sato-Nixon statement in 1969 was to imply the Japan-US Security Treaty would be applied for the maintenance of peace and security in the Taiwan area as an extremely important element of Japan's security. Accordingly, while Japan reserves the right to say no, not to allow the use of bases in Japan for American combat operations at the time of prior consultations, it is to give the US political assurance that the possibility of actually exercising that right, meaning saying no, would be extremely small. Japan has abided by this diplomatic policy based on the Japan-China joint statement and has refrained from having any official relations with Taiwan. The premise of this policy, as explained by Ambassador Kuriyama, is that an environment is maintained in which the Taiwan issue can be resolved peacefully between China and Taiwan. But the recent situation has made it necessary to reconsider this premise. For one thing, Taiwan's democracy has taken root, and as a result, the majority of Taiwanese people do not want to see reunification with the mainland. Another reason is President Xi Jinping's militant leadership. He has said that unifying Taiwan with China is an inevitable requirement for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and has repeatedly stressed that resolving the issue can't keep being passed to the next generation. He also has called on troops at every opportunity to prepare for war. In fact, the recent strengthening of the military power of the Chinese PLA and the expansion of its coercive activities around Taiwan have increased tensions in the region to such an extent that the possibility of a military conflict cannot be ruled out. So I will explain why peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is of vital importance to Japan based on three perspectives of international relations: value, interest, and power. Taiwan has achieved a mature liberal democratic system, and its more than 23 million citizens hope to maintain these values. Japan and the US, which share these fundamental values, must not sit by while China enforces the authoritarian rule of the Communist Party against the will of Taiwan citizens. There are 25,000 Japanese living in Taiwan, and almost as many were visiting there on a daily basis before the COVID-19 pandemic. And the freedom and safety of these Japanese in Taiwan must be protected. Japan's vital sea lanes pass through the Taiwan Strait and the Bashi Strait, and their disruption is a matter of survival for Japan. These vital interests must not be undermined by regional conflicts. Regarding power, military force is the ultimate means of resolving the conflict between the core interests asserted by China, the survival of Taiwan, and the vital national interests of Japan and the United States. In this context, it is a serious concern of Japan and the US that the military balance in the region has tilted significantly toward Chinese preponderance. During the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, China had to back down before the US military, which dispatched 2 aircraft carriers. Based on this bitter lesson, China has formulated a strategy of anti-access and area denial, or A2AD strategy, in order to prevent or delay US military intervention. China seems to have built up the posture and capability to implement that strategy, showing confidence in employing its military forces when necessary. Taiwan is located in the center of the so-called First Island chain, a geopolitical pivot point. Currently, China does not hold any territory of its own on the First Island chain, but if Taiwan were to be unified with China, it would become a base for China's expansion into the Western Pacific. And for Japan, China would hold a choke point that encroaches on vital sea lanes. If this happens, it will be even more difficult for Japan to defend Senkaku Islands. Furthermore, Taiwan and Yonaguni Island are only 110 kilometers apart. A military conflict between China and Taiwan would inevitably involve Japan's southwestern islands as an area of operation. The Kadena Air Base in Okinawa and the US other military bases in Japan will become important bases for the US to support the defense of Taiwan. Therefore, former Prime Minister Abe is correct in his assertion that the Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency, as well as a contingency for the Japan-US alliance. Japan and the US needs to send a clear strategic message to China so that President Xi Jinping will not adopt military measures due to overconfidence or miscalculation. In addition to taking various measures to implement a joint statement in April, it is also necessary to take appropriate response in each case against various actions by China to test the resolve of Japan, the US, and Taiwan, or to undermine mutual trust and cooperation. In addition, as military activities at sea and in the air around Taiwan become more active, the possibility of unexpected events such as unintended on-site collisions or sudden accidents will increase. Therefore, communication frameworks should be developed among all relevant players, including Taiwan and China, to prevent the rapid escalation of such unexpected events. In order to prevent the worst case from happening, it is paradoxical but necessary and effective to assume the worst and be as prepared as possible. This past August in Tokyo, a group of experts who share a sense of crisis regarding the Taiwan issue gathered to conduct a policy simulation for this purpose. I was involved in the planning from the very beginning, and NHK covered the full process of the simulation, which will be aired as a special feature on Sunday, December 26 from 9 p.m. In this exercise, we simulated the Japanese government's response based on 4 different scenarios, from gray zone attack to full-scale invasion. And as a result, we were able to come up with many findings and learn many lessons. I'd like to conclude with some of them to this panel discussion. First, Japan has very little knowledge, concerns, and awareness of the Taiwan issue, including among experts. This is because the political leaders and diplomatic authorities, as I explained at the beginning of this talk, have placed too much emphasis on Japan's consistent position and have been too slow to respond to the changing environment for a peaceful resolution. Or simply put, Taiwan contingency has been a taboo in Japan, so we need to change this mindset. Second, both Japan and the US have different domestic opinions and views on the national interest and strategic objectives in a Taiwan contingency. Therefore, they need to be discussed and hopefully aligned in order for the Japan-US alliance to function effectively. Third, it is necessary to strengthen responses in the gray zone situation, including cyber attacks, information warfare, and military operations short of war. Fourth, Specific plans for the evacuation of Japanese nationals in Taiwan and the protection of the people on the Southwest Islands should be developed, shared, and exercised. And fifth, but not least and last, it is necessary for Japan to strengthen the defense capability based on the above factors in a comprehensive manner, create a national contingency plan, and conduct exercise in coordination with the United States. So I will stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. You've given us a great overview to help us understand the Japanese perspective, looking at both supporting strategic ambiguity as well as strong commitment to the US-Japan alliance and the need for more preparation, which maybe our panel can help contribute to greater knowledge. Which we're very fortunate to have Ambassador Russel to conclude our panel with his remarks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Christina and Chen and everyone. I appreciate it. This has been already a terrific panel with great presentations. I would like to address 5 questions and address them not as a scholar, but as a policymaker. And they are the following. What are US goals in the Asia-Pacific region? What is the Biden administration's Asia strategy? What is our Taiwan policy? What are our Taiwan interests? And what is the administration's Taiwan strategy? So as far as US goals in the Asia Pacific, I'd frame them in 3 baskets. First, to help ensure that the region is stable, it's peaceful, it's prospering, it's open. Second, to bolster respect for international law, universal norms, and human rights, to promote the growth of strong democratic institutions, both national and regional. And thirdly, to prevent the emergence of a sphere of influence in Asia, certainly one in which the region is dominated by a single power, i.e. China. And as for the Biden Asia strategy, so first and foremost, and I can attest to this from my own experience, the administration is sitting about digging out from under the debris of the last 4 years, and also contending with the emergence of a unique peer competitor in China. So the tasks, and these tasks are not limited to Asia, include things like rebuilding America's damaged political, social, and economic foundations, regaining both their functionality, but also their credibility. Those are the 2 essential enablers of international leadership. The second, defending or restoring America's lead in key domains that are being aggressively challenged by the PRC. And that includes technology, and it includes the technologies that have military and industrial, commercial, medical, many other applications. And third, broadening and strengthening international alignment with other countries around core principles and bolstering their willingness to adhere to the rules-based order and to resist Chinese coercive actions that would tend to subvert that existing order. And the Biden administration is using the tools that governments have available to them, like high-level visits to and from the region. Secretary Tony Blinken is in Jakarta as we speak, using quote-unquote discourse power, narrative power, most recently in the form of the Summit for Democracy, resuscitating US alliances, strengthening them to the extent possible. And what some people call minilateral or plurilateral partnerships, things like the Quad, things like the AUKUS agreement and so on, including other formats that draw in partners from as far as away as Europe. It means renewed participation and agenda setting in multilateral institutions like APEC, like ASEAN, East Asia Summit, and so on. They are pursuing ad hoc humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Obviously, the most visible demonstration being vaccine diplomacy or extreme weather resilience kind of support. And on top of that, we've been hearing about the Biden administration's new economic framework. So these are pledges of economic engagement to come in the future. Now, among these tools, there's very little, if anything, that the PRC itself isn't also doing, and in many cases doing more vigorously, and in some cases even more effectively than the United States. But the Biden administration, at least, is putting America back into the game. So as to America's Taiwan policy, well, the inherited policy is a somewhat Talmudic doctrine based on the US-China communiques, the TRA 1979 legislation, a set of assurances the Reagan administration made secretly to Congress, and a lot of sort of common law type precedents and norms. But what's clear is that each administration, and often different officials within the same administration, have very different understandings of what the commitments are and what the policy is. As Shelley explained, we've just seen what looked like a potentially major revision to that policy in the testimony of the Senate, by a Pentagon official. How much of that was done deliberately? How much is a coordinated policy decision? How much was just an abundance of candor and testosterone? I'm not sure I have the answer, but we can talk about that. In any case, the central tenet of US Taiwan policy is the one China policy that holds that the ultimate settlement of the Taiwan question should be made peacefully by people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. Shelley explained this. We don't recognize Taiwan diplomatically. The US made that decision back in 1979. And the US doesn't support Taiwan independence, and it opposes unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. At the same time, the US has close unofficial relations with Taiwan, the definition of which can be very elastic. And the United States is committed to provide Taiwan with military items necessary for it to conduct its own defense, and would consider, quote, an effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means to be a threat to peace and security and of grave concern to the United States. Now, that is the very heart of the so-called strategic ambiguity policy. There is no US-Taiwan Defense Treaty anymore. Washington abrogated that in 1979. The United States, though, retains the decision, therefore, whether or not to defend Taiwan militarily in any given situation, a decision that only the US president can take, depending on the circumstances. It's not automatic. But Washington also, as a matter of policy, tries to maintain the presumption of US intervention as a deterrent to Beijing's use of force. Now, when it comes to US interests with respect to Taiwan, I'd say that the paramount interest is to maintain peace and security, stability in the Taiwan Strait. That has a long tradition in US policy, and it is articulated again and again by incumbent senior administration officials. Beyond that, as we've heard listening to the great presentation by Dr. Chen, Taiwan is a technological powerhouse whose semiconductor industry and other things make it incredibly valuable to the United States, as well as to China, as well as to Japan. And on that list, I'd add Taiwan ideologically is a living rebuke to the Chinese Communist Party's claim that the PRC's governance system is somehow uniquely suited to the Chinese people and that democracy is culturally incompatible somehow. And we also have very significant economic interests in Taiwan, mutual investment, supply chains, and so on. And as General Oue explained, from a security perspective, if the PRC controlled Taiwan, which is located at a critical juncture in the so-called First Island chain along major sea lines of commerce, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, would be in a strong position to deny access to the US, to Japan, to other ships, and otherwise to exercise control over the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And lastly, and in some ways most importantly, US credibility and US deterrence power globally would be devastated if China were successful in taking over Taiwan and subjecting it to direct control the way it has in Hong Kong, whether that was through direct military action, through coercion, through subversion. And that brings me to the last question, the administration's Taiwan strategy. And this is where it gets pretty murky, I'm afraid. You know, on the one hand, as I mentioned, the administration is very clear that its goal is stability and security in the Taiwan Strait and the maintenance of the status quo until and unless a peaceful process between Taipei and Beijing were to yield an outcome that the people on both sides of the strait could accept. On the other hand, it's far from clear that Washington has the means, the ability to assure that outcome. For one thing, as General Oue mentioned, the balance of military power is shifting, and there's no longer certainty that PRC military action against Taiwan would fail. And secondly, there is virtually, and to say virtually is a little bit generous, there's virtually no dialogue between Washington and Beijing or between Taipei and Beijing, meaning there are no diplomatic or political tools to support the goal of cross-strait stability. So picking up a point that Shelley Rigger just made, what's been conspicuously absent is credible assurance, reassurance that is credible, believable, reassurance to Beijing that the United States is not shifting to a one China, one Taiwan policy, and that the United States isn't encouraging those on Taiwan who favor de jure independence. Or reassurance that's credible to Washington that Beijing is still intent on peaceful unification and won't try to coerce Taiwan or threaten, let alone use force to impose unification. And reassurance between Taipei and Beijing that Taiwan won't abandon any prospect of peaceful unification and that the PRC won't take action to harm Taiwan or its people. And it may well be that the time when reassurances could possibly be credible to the other party has passed. But in any case, what we are seeing instead of that are gestures and threats. The PRC has dramatically escalated its threatening military signaling. It's undertaken punitive economic measures towards Taiwan. It's doubled down on its mean-spirited strategy of denying Taiwan's international space, blocking its participation in international organizations and poaching its few remaining diplomatic partners. The US has acted to demonstrate its support of Taiwan's democratic society, to demonstrate its desire to see Taiwan better integrated into the international system, to encourage gestures of support for Taiwan from third countries, to push Taiwan to take overdue steps to bolster its own defense capabilities and to deploy and to display US military assets in ways that Washington intends to serve as a deterrent to China. And as Shelley warned, this is fueling a vicious cycle. The more Beijing threatens, the more Washington and others push back. And the more resistance to unification grows on Taiwan, prompting Beijing to send even starker warnings and we have to assume, to make further preparations for plan B, so to speak, including the use of force. And so it goes, rinse and repeat, the security dilemma. So I'll just end by saying that I believe we are at a very dangerous impasse in which no one wants to take military action, but where the risk is very high. And the mechanisms to manage or to de-escalate a crisis simply aren't operational at this moment. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. This has been an incredible overview and insightful analysis of the critical issues we face. On the one hand, we've heard from Professor Chen that there is a positive case for economic engagement. And even in the midst of a pandemic, Taiwanese engineers work in Nanjing and airplanes fly back and forth across the straits delivering parts so that my son does not need to worry that he won't get the latest iPhone. So there's a positive story of economic engagement. At the same time, we've heard that the Japanese military establishment probably needs to take more training and information exchange for contingencies, and that the United States government must be extremely careful to give very clear reassurance about the commitment to ambiguity. And this reminds me and makes me want to ask a question about the core theme of the panel, economic security linkages, which draws on the problem of, in making reassurance, what is the role of economic policy to a tense security standoff? And my concern is I look back at 2014, the Ukrainian crisis, which many forget started with Ukraine trying to decide between a European Partnership Agreement or the Customs Union. And that spurred civilian protests, overthrow of government, Russian intervention, much more than just about a trade agreement. But the signaling about trade agreements led to some confusion and instability. Now, I'm not saying that would happen in Taiwan, but I do worry right now. We have this situation where the United States government understands that calling for Taiwan to have membership in the United Nations would be provocative and a complete reversal of US policy, and no one in the US government is even contemplating such a step. On the other hand, Taiwan and China are both full equal members of the World Trade Organization. The US status quo and the world status quo accepts this. But right now we confront this awkward situation of members of Congress calling for a free trade agreement with Taiwan. Yesterday, Prime Minister Kishida was asked in the Diet about how Japan views the application for CPTPP membership by China and Taiwan. So my concern is nobody wants a US free trade agreement with Taiwan or Taiwanese membership in the CPTPP to spark a crisis. But in all of our signaling about reassurance, our talks about these economic agreements a high risk? And are the economic officials equally aware of the stakes in each one of these decisions, so that it's a comprehensive policy discussion about the economic needs to keep our supply chain secure, to support an important economy, and the security needs of having stability in the region? So that's my question to the panel. And I'd like you to hold your thoughts. We're going to collect one more question before we turn to you, and then we turn to our audience. So joining us from our associates, we have Professor Kristen Vicasi, who is associate professor at the University of Maine, and also the author of a very important new book on risk management strategies of Japanese companies in China, political crisis of multinational firms. So she is indeed the expert to have many questions about the themes we've been discussing. So I'll invite Kristen to ask her question. I'll turn to you for brief answers, and then we'll open up to our audience.
Thank you. Thanks for these great presentations. My question's really related to Professor Davis's question as well. I'm really concerned hearing these presentations today and just looking at the world about the dynamics of the commercial piece in Northeast Asia are undermined by some of these increased policy focuses on economic security, diversifying supply chains away from China, as well as China's increasing self-sufficiency, makes it maybe less reliant on partners. So what panelists, what are things that the Taiwanese or Japanese governments could do to try and maintain this commercial piece, as well as simultaneously maintaining a competitive business edge in the global economy? And specifically, do you think, related to Professor Davis's question, that mutual Taiwanese and Chinese membership in the CPTPP could help here? And is this realistic? Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. I'd like to turn and see if you'd each like to make a few brief comments.
Do you have a particular order in mind?
Shall we start?
Okay. Yeah, do I need to do anything with my machines? Okay.
You're all set.
Okay, thank you. This is a very fresh perspective for me to be thinking about the economics of the relationship as the potential catalyst for conflict, or as a source of further decline in the regional relationships. Because most of the time when we're looking at Taiwan, we are thinking about the economic piece as the one bright spot, right? That, the fact, actually what Professor Chen outlined is an extraordinarily close and interdependent economic relationship between these two entities that otherwise have very prickly and in some ways almost non-existent relations. And I think if we look at the ways in which both sides, even under leadership that is quite at this kind of political level, quite willing to express really negative sentiment toward the other side, the lengths they go to make sure that the economic relationship is protected is very interesting. And I also would just point out that the Taiwanese participation in the PRC economy seems to have operated largely independent of the political dynamics over time. So just for example, the most accelerated period of cross-strait trade and investment was the presidency of Chen, the first DPP president, who was the one most objectionable to Beijing. So I guess, I would have to really think about flipping that perspective, because from Taiwan, we generally think of the economic relationship as a break on conflict and as an opportunity for some recognition that the two sides actually are engaged in a win-win interaction on the economic front, even if everything else seems pretty gloomy. As for could the PRC and Taiwan both be in CPTPP, I think not, because I think the PRC has accepted certain historical realities by necessity. The PRC wanted to be in the WTO, so the fact that Taiwan was also going to be in the WTO, that was, they had to make their choice. But with CPTPP, I think a new initiative, I can't imagine the PRC prioritizing their own participation over their need to keep Taiwan from gaining access to such an organization. So I think that that one will be zero sum.
I think it'll be easier to stay in the room and then go online. So,
Okay.
Ambassador Russel.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Well, it is a fascinating question to think about trade and economics. On the one hand, as national interests that could intensify friction. On the other hand, as a potential balm and remedy to problems in the relationship. And I think that there has been in the past a tendency to see trade as the latter, a kind of therapeutic form of integration. People are fond of differentiating the current strategic rivalry between the US and China from the Cold War by emphasizing the point of economic integration and mutual dependency between the two countries in the world. But I just mentioned two dramatic shifts. One is that technology has really changed the equation. It changed the equation in the sense that whereas technology in the past, in the 60s, 70s, routinely flowed from government investments, from NASA, from the Pentagon, into the commercial sector, that tide has completely reversed. And it's today the private sector that is constantly developing profound new technologies that impact the world. And it's then a matter of exploring those technologies for their military and other national applications. So I think that that has altered the potential risk factor in open commerce and in sharing technology. Secondly, we are, even though nobody likes the word decoupling, we are seeing a trend, both organic and deliberate, that looks a lot like decoupling, and some of it is unmistakably willful decoupling, as in the announced Chinese policy of dual circulation, which seeks to create a kind of carefully curated membrane that only allows certain things to flow in either direction across China's border, making the world more dependent on China and China less dependent on the world. This is driving national champions, indigenous innovation, and so on. And at the same time, we're seeing a spurt in investment screening and in other national policies, not only in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, to guard against the continuation of brazen Chinese state-sponsored theft of intellectual property and other problems like that. So Tom Friedman's famous, Big Mac principle, the theory that no two countries with McDonald's franchises will ever go to war, regrettably is not looking too good. So as far as what can governments, the US government, the Japanese government, do to both maintain economic links and protect security, obviously that's a tough question. I think one thing certainly is to develop clear policies that industry can understand and maintain a certain amount of consistency in those policies, so that what is not proscribed can be undertaken. Right now, we're seeing a lot of countries backing away. A lot of risk comes from uncertainty, not from policies per se. Secondly, I think it's important and legitimate for countries like Japan, the United States, and others to protect themselves. And they may wish to protect themselves not only in terms of managing investments and so on, and supply chains, but also in terms of blocking the outflow of certain kinds of technology that have many, as virtually do have many applications. But I think that we have to also thirdly be rigorous in differentiating between blocking the outflow of technology or even blocking China's ability to develop in certain directions that are threatening to other countries. Differentiating between that and policies that aim to sabotage, to undermine, to hurt China in a mean-spirited or a blunt way. That is a very different and a highly problematic set of policies. And then with respect to CPTPP, what I would say is that we'd be foolish if we overestimated the likelihood that countries like Japan or Australia or Canada are going to stand as firm bulwarks against a Chinese sustained push for entry. I think that that is a rather thin reed to hold on to in terms of hope, notwithstanding the resistance within each of these countries. I think that even if the Chinese application to CPTPP is built on hollow promises, it will be very difficult to resist, absent the United States as it currently is structured. For Taiwan, the only scenario that I can imagine would be one in which the condition of Beijing's entry to CPTPP were simultaneous entry to Taiwan. And maybe unlike Shelley, I don't consider that to be impossible, although I wouldn't bet my own money on it. Extremely difficult, would require a tremendous amount of resolve on the part of the CPTPP members. I'm not predicting it, but I don't exclude it from the realm of the possible.
Great, thank you. I'm going to bring in Professor Chen, and then Oisan, I'm going to hold off and have you answer some of the questions we have on security that are coming up in the Q&A. So Professor Chen, if you want to briefly answer the questions from myself and Kristen.
Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Professor Chen, can you unmute yourself?
Okay. Now, let me very briefly echo Professor Russell's comments on the mutual membership problem of Taiwan and China into TPP. We certainly appreciate a supporting voice, particularly from Prime Minister Kishida the other day in dialogue. But I tend to agree with Professor Russell because there are 11 members there, and some are particularly close to China, such as Peru. And this is a consensus process. So even with the strong support with the other member, and some members are really in between, they're ambiguous about whether they welcome China or they welcome Taiwan into the group. So I believe China will certainly exercise all its diplomatic power to prevent Taiwan from joining this organization if China is left out. I recall that before China announced its intention to apply for membership of CPTPP, there was a statement by the Taiwan office of the Chinese government saying that if Taiwan wants to join this, it has to follow the one China principle. So probably this statement was not noticed a lot in the media, but we do notice that one. So that means one China principle, as far as we understand, it means the WTO model or the APEC model. So therefore that, of course, China posed a big problem for TPP. It's such a high standard. China will obviously not be able to meet the standard. They are already members of the organization that proposing that the standard should be lowered for China to enter. So I think this will be a long process if China is going to be processed, sort of allowed to enter into the negotiation process. But however, I do think this allowing China to enter this process may at least alleviate some opposing pressures from some of the parties. From Taiwan's viewpoint, of course, our people, if we try to sign the FTA with China, and that was opposed by the young people. So we remember that. But as so far as we talk about joining TPP, there doesn't seem to be much opposition if we are going to join it together with China. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Certainly, eventually, I think we, as I say, that we probably cannot isolate Taiwan from China anyway, and some kind of economic integration or connection, if you like, it's to the like of the Chinese leadership also. So that's one thing. So let me just follow on and comment a little bit on this economic, the commercial piece and the security issues. I think that the confrontation, the friction there, because you're seeking economic interest from China, therefore you get yourself in trouble. Your national security may be in danger. That's always our concern from the very beginning, as I have explained, okay? And I think at this point now, China really didn't pay much attention to how much Taiwan can help them, except probably for the semiconductor industry. The other industry, they never look at Taiwan as a source of technology or investment. So they are already at a stage, they are quite confident. And after the trade war, actually, they are taking proactive actions to decouple their industries, so to speak, or voluntarily from the Western world, because they worry about the US may be using this supply chain connection to chop their throat. And for example, if you look at the recent policy on the internet business, all these Alibaba and the others, the policy is really to discourage connections, asking their company to delist themselves from the American Stock Exchange and going home, and all this control on the data flow. All this is decoupling. It's a very clear decoupling thing. You will never be able to connect with the West anymore using this policy background. And so it's true on the semiconductor production. They are producing their own equipment, try to be self-independent in every segment of the supply chain. So I think the policy now, we also need to pay some attention to the really economic pressure now on the Chinese government. I believe I do not have the opportunity to look at this economy in person now, but you look at some of the data, you can sense that they are really under tremendous pressure because the economy is slowing down, which is quite clear. And it's expected to be slowing down for a long, long time because of the aging population. So there will be no 5-6% growth anymore in the future. You could be looking at 3 or 4% growth rate in the next 10, 20 years. That's more realistic. If economic theory tells us anything, this is the reality. No matter what you do, how capable your policy could be, unless China is really inventing a new economic growth model, which we've never seen before in history. Otherwise, this growth rate is going to slow down, and there's tremendous pressure for social security needs to taking care of the older elderly. So I believe this will also slow down their military spending. That's something maybe a little bit good news for people are concerned with this military sort of build up that they used to be. And more importantly, that in order the policy they have adopted until today is really, they really freeze a lot of resources under the government control, such as the local government and state-owned enterprises. And this government has no intention to further liberalize or to introduce more market forces into it. So therefore, these resources will be frozen there for a long, long time also, because without restructuring and letting go some of the sort of non-productive companies and letting the real estate prices coming down, without this, typical market adjustment, you're not going to have industrial restructuring. So this is another thing that we worry because of the economic difficulties. So they are putting a lot of more military exercise over the the Taiwan space in order to draw attention of their people. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'm now going to turn to the security side. We have several questions in the chat. Because it's very late at night and we're nearing the end of our time, I'm just going to summarize a few themes and ask Oi-san to do his best to answer a little bit. So one of the concerns is, has the US-Japan coordination been sufficient for the contingency planning? And would the US, Japan, and regional allies have the capacity to defend Taiwan? There's also concern about whether the nuclear attack scenario is realistically part of these calculations. And if not, how you can communicate the scenarios related to a nuclear contingency planning. So if you could briefly talk about the US-Japan military contingency planning and whether any of this discussion includes nuclear and how you relate this communication to the region in just a couple of minutes.
Well, I just want to say one word regarding the CPTPP. Japan wants to maintain rule-based order in economic area, and making promise is different from keeping promise. So Ambassador Russel means hollow promise. We have to be careful to deal with this Chinese hollow promise. And Japan wants United States to come back to the TPP as a strong partner to maintain this rule-based economic world. Regarding the nuclear scenario, this is very, very important yet sensitive issue. I think the coordination between Japan and the United States regarding the any contingency, I think we have established a very high standard to conduct operation together. However, nuclear extended deterrence changed very much recently. Because of the China's rapid expansion of the strategic nuclear capability, and also their change of no first use policy, probably. And I think the mutually assured deterrence theory must be restudied because of those dynamics among China and United States and Russia are very different from the Cold War logic. So I think the Japan and even Taiwan should be reassured from United States with respect to the extended nuclear deterrence. I don't know to what extent officials have already discussed about these things, but this is not only the responsibility of the military people, but also the ordinary people should be aware of the importance of this nuclear deterrence.
Thank you so much. Would you like to say just a couple of sentences? You can choose which part you'd like to
Sure.
emphasize.
Well, thank you. With respect to the US and Japan, I would simply say that in a Taiwan contingency, the US can't successfully defend Taiwan without Japanese support. Whether it is minimal or extensive makes a big difference, but there is a straightforward black and white proposition there. Secondly, were Japan's very formidable defense capabilities added to the equation in a Taiwan contingency, it would mean very significant increase in the problem set that the PLA were to face. And so I think that the recent statement by Prime Minister Abe and other indicators from Defense Minister Kishi and former Deputy Defense Minister Nakayama have definitely complicated the planning challenge that the PLA faces.
And the last word, Shelley?
I guess the only thing I would say is that, whenever we're talking about the military questions, there's a question in the Q&A that I noticed that said, well, what about the second time? So you brush them back the first time, what about the second? That I think gets really absolutely to the heart of the matter, which is that there is no resolution of the Taiwan problem that is not ultimately in some way negotiated. And it seems to me that it should be possible to achieve it without military conflict, if that is the nature of the problem. And I suppose, that there is one alternative to a negotiated solution, and that is a successful military takeover of Taiwan by the PRC. But that too seems, when you actually get to the point of looking at what, at some point the Taiwan side has to surrender and reach a settlement. And so even there, the resolution is some kind of negotiation. So I guess it seems to me that we ought to be looking for ways to resolve this, or to not resolve it, but to extend the period of irresolution into the future, rather than talking so much about the military conflict.
I can't resist jumping in and adding my voice to Shelley's to say that very smart people have looked at this problem from every angle, but I don't believe anyone has found a superior alternative to maintaining the status quo and extending the ambiguous circumstance that allow the free and democratic society on Taiwan to flourish, and the official legal diplomatic status of Taiwan to remain uncertain. But that can't be done if the door to possible unification is slammed shut and bolted, as recent signals from Washington seem to suggest.
Our conversation today has only reinforced the importance of bringing experts together, because maintaining this delicate status quo with an open door to unification and an open commitment to the stability of democracy in Taiwan and a greater vision for the future, all of this can only be achieved if we have conversations like today that bring together academics, policymakers, experts from all countries in the region. And so I thank you all for joining us. especially our panelists, staying up late in Taipei and Tokyo, and many in the audience. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we could not directly answer all of your questions. And thank you also for the associates here joining us in the room and our staff for promoting the event. It's really been a pleasure, and I appreciate your time.